Welcome back. Over the hundreds of years since Constantinople fell, spoilers for those of you who didn't know, the word Byzantine has come to mean labyrinthine, bureaucratic, or excessively complex. In most cases, this is unfair, but with the origins of our next emperor and the background to his path to the throne, excessively complex is a bit of an understatement. This one might get complicated in a kind of Game of Thrones type way, so maybe take notes as we go along. Romanos II came to the throne at 959 CE at the age of 20 after the death of his father. At the age of 14, he'd been married to a daughter of the King of Italy, but she died a few years into the marriage, and Romanos was allowed to choose his second wife. He chose the daughter of a tavern keeper from Sparta. Now, how and when they met isn't known, but they married in 956, and when she became empress, she took the name Theophano. A lot of what we know about Theophano, which isn't very much, to be honest, comes from later sources which tend to be quite hostile to her. In fact, even the daughter of a tavern keeper part of her background may be a creation designed to belittle her. All we can say for certain is that she didn't come from an aristocratic family. She was described as the most beautiful woman of her age, and young Romanos was, by all accounts, bewitched by her, to the extent that after their marriage, the first thing Romanos did was pack his 5 sisters, kicking and screaming, off to a number of different convents, supposedly at Theophano's request. Now, her humble origins meant that she was unpopular from the start. When her father-in-law died a few years after her marriage to Romanos, Theophano got the blame, with rumours spreading that she had poisoned him. The fact that he had displayed no symptoms of poisoning and had in fact been ill for some time seemed to make no difference. Romanos doesn't seem to have been a bad emperor, but he wasn't a particularly good or even engaged one either. Day-to-day running of the empire was left to a eunuch called Joseph Bringas, and 3 generals took care of the defence and expansion of the empire: Nicephorus Phocas, his brother Leo, and their nephew John Tzimiskes. Nicephorus recaptured the island of Crete, during which campaign he came up with the idea of catapulting the severed heads of captured citizens into the besieged cities to encourage them to surrender. It was a successful tactic, and once the island was secured, he headed east to join with John Tzimiskes, and the two of them recaptured the city of Aleppo, liberating it from the Hamdanid emir. Back in Constantinople, Romanos wasn't doing very much aside from fathering children, including the future emperors Basil II and Constantine VIII, whom he crowned as co-emperors in 962. The following year, at the age of 25, he died. Again, Theophano got the blame. But this seems unlikely. Firstly, because she was still recovering from giving birth to a daughter, Anna, 48 hours beforehand. And secondly, because Romanos' death immediately put Theophano and her children in danger. Recognizing this, Theophano needed to act quickly. As empress, traditionally, she would be regent to Basil II, who was 5 at the time. But that was just a tradition. There was no law enforcing that. Her lack of aristocratic background meant that she didn't have the support she would need to prevent a challenge, and so she needed a powerful ally. She sent word to Nicephorus, telling him to return to Constantinople to meet her immediately. Now, Nicephorus was an interesting character, beloved by his troops, nicknamed the Morning Star because they said they would follow him anywhere. He was a highly religious man, a vegetarian, which was rare outside of monasteries. He wore a hair shirt under his tunic and talked often of retiring to the monastery he had founded on Mount Athos. He returned to Constantinople and, despite having displayed no interest in women since the death of his wife many years before, married Theophano, becoming emperor and regent for Basil II. This secured Basil's position and Theophano's. Joseph Bringas was expelled, and a eunuch called Basil Lecapenos installed in his place. Lecapenos is a big figure in Byzantine history. He was chief minister for nearly 40 years under 6 different emperors, and we'll come back to him in a little while. But for now, this union wasn't universally welcomed. Many of the clergy, including the patriarch at the time, were against it. It was a second marriage for both of them, something the church frowned upon, and also because Nicephorus was already Basil and Constantine's godfather, meaning that Nicephorus and Theophano were in a prohibited relationship. Nicephorus got around this by convening a council and simply declaring that rule void. And so despite opposition, the marriage went ahead. Almost as soon as he was crowned, Nicephorus was off to battle again, first in Cilicia, where he extended Byzantine control further south, and then to Syria. Meanwhile, having got what she wanted from him, Theophano was growing rather bored of her highly religious and frequently absent husband and looked for amusement elsewhere. Again, this narrative comes from later sources, so we have to be careful of the implicit misogyny here, but contemporary sources do say that Theophano and John Tzimiskes began an affair. Although we don't know when it began, sources show that it was ongoing in late 968, even though Nicephorus had been back from the battlefield since early 967. Just before he returned to Constantinople, Nicephorus had struck a deal with the Kievan prince Sviatoslav I. The Bulgars were once again threatening the north of the empire, but Nicephorus had his hands full in the east and didn't want to shift his focus, so to speak. Instead, he sent an envoy to Kiev with the promise of 1,500 pounds of gold if Sviatoslav would attack the Bulgars. Sviatoslav jumped at the chance and far exceeded Byzantine hopes and expectations in his campaign, overrunning Bulgarian regions, capturing the Bulgarian Tsar, and annexing the northeast of the region. Nicephorus's plot essentially had been too successful. It had removed the Bulgarian threat and replaced it with an even stronger one. But that was a problem that would have to wait. Tzimiskes was almost the polar opposite of his uncle. Handsome, young, charismatic and dashing, and it wasn't long before a plot took shape. Despite his conquests and his popularity with his soldiers, Nicephorus wasn't much loved elsewhere. The clergy found him troublesome, and the population hated him because of the high taxes he imposed to fund his martial adventures. In December 969, Theophano unlocked the doors to Nicephorus's chambers, and assassins sneaked in and killed the emperor. John Tzimiskes was directly involved, kicking his uncle almost to death before someone else ran him through with a sword. The deed done, John calmly walked from the bedchamber to the throne room where Theophano, Basil, and Constantine were waiting, and was proclaimed the new emperor. But having swallowed Nicephorus, the church wasn't willing to do the same with John. The patriarch refused to allow John to enter the Hagia Sophia to be formally crowned unless he met 3 conditions. First, he had to undo all legislation relating to the confiscation of church property. Second, he had to name and punish the people involved in the death of Nicephorus. And third, he had to exile Theophano and never see her again. John was a pragmatist and immediately agreed to all 3 conditions. He needed the church's support far more than he needed Theophano as a wife. A humiliated Theophano was banished to a monastery outside Constantinople and vanishes at that point from primary sources. What happened to her after that is lost to history. Some historians suggest that she was recalled to court when Basil became emperor, and while that's possible, this recall isn't mentioned in any of the primary sources available. Anyway, the new emperor wasted no time in consolidating his position. He repealed Nicephorus's hated taxation, married one of Romanus II's 5 sisters, binding him into the Macedonian family. There was also the issue of Prince Sviatoslav, who by now had amassed a large army and was poised to attack Byzantium, threatening Constantinople itself. So in 970, John's forces halted Sviatoslav's advance at Arcadiopolis. This forced Sviatoslav to withdraw north, buying the Byzantine forces time to assemble a larger army of up to 40,000 men, including cavalry and siege equipment, which was then supported by the Byzantine navy, blocking the Danube and preventing Sviatoslav's escape that way. In April 971, Tzimiskes surprised and stormed the Bulgarian capital, capturing Tsar Boris II and dismantling the Rus-Bulgarian alliance. He then advanced to Dorostolon, which is modern Silistra, besieging Sviatoslav's remaining troops for 65 days with constant assaults, Greek fire from ships, and blockade tactics that starved the Rus. In July of that year, after 5 major battles, John used cavalry reserves to counter a Rus challenged Sviatoslav to single combat, which he refused, and encircled the enemy on open ground, slaughtering around 15,000 Rus. Sviatoslav surrendered Bulgaria, released captives, and retreated back across the Danube with Byzantine-supplied grain in exchange for a truce and renewed trade rights. John initially framed the victory as a liberation of Bulgaria, but he then annexed the eastern part of the Bulgarian Empire for Byzantium. The Bulgarian problem solved, for now, we call that foreshadowing, John headed east once more to tackle the Abbasids. Returning to Constantinople after his second eastern campaign, he fell ill. Some later reports suggest poisoning, but historians think it was more likely that it was typhoid fever. He barely made it back to the city in time to receive the last rites, and he died in January 976. With John dead, Basil II finally ascended to the position of senior emperor at the age of 18. He was poorly equipped to handle it. His father had died when he was 5, and the empire had been run by a combination of Nicephorus, John Tzimiskes, and powerful eunuchs, limiting him to purely ceremonial roles. So while he was now senior emperor in name, Basil Lekepenos, the chief minister that I mentioned earlier, continued to govern the empire, managing administration, finance, and court politics. All the while, Basil II was doing his learning essentially on the job, watching and slowly asserting his independence. The early phase of Basil's reign was marked by profound challenges, including 2 major aristocratic revolts. The first revolt, led by Bardas Skleros in around 976, posed a real threat to Basil's authority as Skleros tried to take control of the empire. The situation was then made worse when Bardas Phocas, another powerful noble, launched a second rebellion around 987. Now, while all this was going on, Basil was in a protracted conflict with the First Bulgarian Empire, so what was left of Bulgaria after John had annexed part of it, which was still a strong rival that had long challenged Byzantine power in the Balkans. In 985, Basil led his troops towards Sardica, modern-day Sofia, the Bulgarians' main stronghold in the region. But instead of attacking directly, he paused to wait for his rearguard to catch up. This, it turned out, was a disastrous mistake because it gave the Bulgarians time to prepare, and they ambushed the Byzantine army, delivering a crushing defeat. Basil had to return to Constantinople humiliated, ashamed, and angry, and he swore an oath to get his revenge on the entire Bulgar nation. However, defeat at the Trajan Gate had caused more than just humiliation for Basil. This was the event that triggered Bardas Phocas to launch his rebellion. So the decisive turning point for Basil came during this second revolt. To counter the formidable forces led by Bardas Phocas, Basil looked for military assistance from Vladimir of Kiev, the Grand Prince of the Kievan Rus, and the son of Sviatoslav I. Now, Vladimir had been shopping around for a new religion for himself and his people, sending representatives to Muslims, Jews, and Roman Catholics, none of whom, it seemed, impressed him very much. When his representatives arrived in Constantinople, they were treated to a special service in the Hagia Sophia, which they felt was so beautiful, they didn't know whether they were on earth or in heaven. So in a smart political move, Basil offered the hand of his sister, Anna, in marriage to Vladimir, on the condition that he accept the Orthodox faith and provide troops to Basil. Vladimir was considered a barbarian by the Byzantines. He wasn't a Christian. He had at least 4 wives already and 800 concubines. So the marriage of a Byzantine princess to a foreign heathen was unprecedented, and something about which Anna was far from pleased too. But marrying Anna would give Vladimir immense prestige, immediately elevating him from a barbarian prince to a serious ruler with legitimate ties to the Byzantine Empire, significantly raising his stature among other rulers. It would also shift the Rus from pagan polygamy to Christian monarchy, a significant expansion for the Orthodox Church and a win, so to speak, over the Roman Church and Islam. So despite Anna's tearful objections, the marriage went ahead, and in exchange for this royal alliance, Vladimir provided Basil with 6,000 Varangian troops, renowned for their fierce loyalty and combat skills. This was enough to bolster Basil's army and allow him to decisively suppress the rebellion by 989. With the revolt quelled, Basil established the Varangian Guard as a permanent imperial unit, a move that would enhance the protection of the empire and support future military endeavours. Lecapenus, by this time already sidelined by Basil, was accused of conspiring with Bardas Phocas. He was placed under house arrest and then exiled, with all his property confiscated, all his laws repealed, and all his supporters purged from office. Lecapenus' riches, which were considerable, went to fund Basil's military campaigns. Interestingly, though, or perhaps not surprisingly, there were no trials and no evidence, no documents, no witnesses, no confessions, nothing to suggest any conspiracy at all. And it seems more likely that the plot was just a fiction that allowed Basil to finally remove Lecapenus and completely erase his legacy. Lecapenus arguably deserved better. Basil's campaign against the Bulgars lasted for several decades. His determination and strategic prowess made him a relentless enemy. While progress wasn't always fast, it was steady, and victory soon began to look inevitable. The final straw came in October 1014. Basil's forces routed the Bulgars and captured 15,000 soldiers. What happened next is horrific. The captives were divided into groups of 100, and in what was essentially a production line, 99 out of each 100 men was blinded with hot pokers, needles, or knives. The 100th man was blinded in only one eye. It took 3 days to accomplish this feat, after which each group, led by the one-eyed man, was forced to march for a week to the Bulgarian city of Prespa, which was where the Bulgarian Tsar had fled after his defeat. The psychological effect of this was devastating, as Basil must surely have intended. Upon seeing the horrific remains of his army as they entered Prespa, the Bulgarian Tsar collapsed and died just a few days later, most likely of a stroke or a heart attack. More broadly, the morale of the Bulgarian population was shattered. Taking care of the survivors placed a massive burden on families in mostly rural communities already ravaged by decades of war. Bulgarian forces fielded armies the following year, but with reduced cohesion and no doubt demoralized and fearful soldiers. Surrenders without fighting increased, accelerating the collapse of organized resistance, and by 1018 it was all over. The First Bulgarian Empire was no more, fully subsumed into the Byzantine Empire, significantly expanding the empire's territorial dominion. In addition to his endeavours in the north, Basil strengthened the empire's eastern frontiers through campaigns in Syria, Armenia, and Georgia. He renewed truces with the Fatimid Caliphate in 987 and again in the year 1000, which stabilised the southern border and allowed Byzantium to redirect its military focus towards the north and the west. Domestically, Basil implemented a series of policies aimed at limiting the power of the large landowning aristocracy, which had grown increasingly influential at the expense of imperial authority. He enforced legislation designed to protect small landholders and to preserve imperial tax revenues, creating a more equitable system that fortified the backbone of Byzantine agriculture. His personal austerity and strict fiscal management contributed to a well-supplied imperial treasury by the time of his death, which came in December 1025, seemingly of natural causes after an unprecedented reign of nearly 50 years as senior emperor, 65 years if you date it from the time of his ascension to co-emperor. It's the longest in imperial Roman history. At his death, the empire stood at its highest territorial, military, and economic peak since the reign of Justinian the Great. Basil's empire may not have been as geographically vast as Justinian's, which included Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain. It was more stable, it was more defensible, more fiscally solvent, and militarily more effective than the empire Justinian had left. Was Basil popular? He was certainly idolized by his troops, who saw him as a tireless campaigner who shared hardships and rewarded loyalty with loot from Bulgaria and Armenia. More broadly, most people benefited from stable grain prices, anti-aristocrat laws, protecting smallholders, and the general dividends of peace. They seem to have viewed him as a stern but effective guardian against invasions. Only the elites took a different view, resenting his taxes on the rich, his laws returning land to the poor, his general distrust of nobles, and his general avoidance of lavish ceremonies. But what grief there was soon turned to apprehension as it became clear that Basil's successors would squander much of what he had amassed, and the empire would never be as powerful again. Next time we'll look at the reign of Romanos IV Diogenes, whose attempts to expand the empire resulted in his capture, ransom, blinding, and death after one of Byzantium's greatest military failures. But until then, thank you for joining me. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe on your way out. And whatever you're up to, have a great day.